Russian President Vladimir Putin wants war with NATO. Not a direct war, that would cost too much money and expose an already weakened Russia while the Ukraine war is ongoing. Instead, Putin wants a hybrid war, one that will weaken NATO's eastern front until Russia is ready to attack. How do we know? Germany says so. Recent German intelligence has revealed that Russia is planning to send nasty little green men into the Baltic states. With this plot, Putin hopes to weaken some of NATO's smaller members, perhaps in preparation for a full-blown invasion. On June 9th, Reuters reported on comments made by Bruno Karl to the Table Media news organization. Karl, who currently serves as the head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, says that Putin has a devious little plan that he believes could weaken NATO by testing its collective defense, possibly through hybrid tactics in the Baltics. "We are quite certain, and we have intelligence showing it, that Ukraine is only a step on the journey westward," Karl claimed. The German intelligence chief emphasized that Russia isn't looking for a full-blown war yet. "That doesn't mean we expect tank armies to roll westward," Karl said. "But we see that NATO's collective defense promise is to be tested." The implication here is that Putin thinks that NATO isn't the unified force it once was, and that division within the organization has created an opportunity for Russia to do some serious damage. We'll return to that point later in the video. For now, what does Karl think that Putin is planning? The intelligence chief says that Germany isn't envisaging any sort of direct military confrontation that would see Russian soldiers fighting against NATO forces in places like Estonia and Latvia. Instead, Putin is going to start testing NATO's resolve, and to do it, he will use people that Karl dubs little green men. They don't need to dispatch armies of tanks for that, Karl says when talking about Putin's intended tests of NATO's unity. It's enough to send little green men to Estonia to protect supposedly oppressed Russian minorities. Little green men. That phrasing may conjure up visions of the small army men soldiers from Toy Story, but Russia's little green men are a very real problem that Putin has used before to sow the seeds of discontent in nations that he targets. To understand what these men do, we only need to go back to 2014 and the outbreak of the initial war between Russia and Ukraine. During that conflict, Putin didn't want to push his troops directly into Ukraine. It's not that Putin didn't believe Russia could beat Ukraine back then. If anything, the opposite was true. As the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft points out, the Ukrainian army in 2014 was hopelessly weak. Even compared to what it was in 2022, Putin came under criticism for not launching a full-scale invasion in 2014, the resource says. But Putin had his reasons for not sending in the full force of Russia's military back then. For Putin, the 2014 war against Ukraine was about driving a wedge between the US and Europe by pushing Europe into accepting Russia as a full partner. Division was Putin's goal. And as we'll see soon, his belief in the division he's created is emboldening him to test NATO's resolve. Back to the little green men. These were Russian soldiers who Putin sent into Ukraine. Only they weren't typical soldiers. The little green men were masked and wore unmarked uniforms, along with being equipped with the weapons and equipment you might expect a Russian soldier to have. The masks and uniforms gave Putin an out. He'd always claimed that Russia had no direct military involvement in Ukraine or Crimea during the 2014 conflict. Troops that bore no identifiable hallmarks of the Russian army were the Russian leader's way of maintaining plausible deniability. Putin could, in theory, shrug and say, "I have no idea who these men are. Perhaps they're simply men who are so passionate about my cause that they've chosen to take up arms to fight against Ukrainian oppression." The little green men did plenty for Russia's leader during the 2014 war. Between February and March 2014, it was these hidden soldiers who blocked the Sevastopol and Simferopol airports in Crimea. The BBC reported at the time that it had seen 8 trucks with the black plates of the Russian army moving towards Simferopol, along with 8 Russian military choppers arriving in Sevastopol. However, Putin still maintained the illusion that Russia wasn't directly invading, and he used his little green men to do it. Putin's little green men were also active in the Donbas region of Ukraine during the 2014 crisis. Again, Putin tried to deny any Russian involvement. He claimed that the soldiers were merely separatists in the region fighting to disentangle the Donbas from Ukrainian control. Ukraine wasn't fooled. The Financial Times reported back in 2014 that Ukraine's then First Deputy Prime Minister, Vitaly Yarema, believed that the little green men operating in the Donbas were servicemen of the Russian 45th Airborne Regiment. Eventually, Putin owned up to his subterfuge. On April 17, 2014, Putin confirmed that Russian military personnel had been operating in Ukraine, but by that point the damage had been done. Russia had successfully annexed Crimea and created massive tensions in the Donbas region. Satisfied with the outcome, Putin clearly felt that he could come clean. What was anybody going to do about it? NATO wasn't going to war with Russia over Crimea. Putin could flaunt his little trick in NATO's collective face as a power move because he knew that there would be no response to what his little green men had accomplished. More importantly for Russia's leader, he discovered a strategy that worked. Granted, the little green men would never be enough to enable Russia to fully take a nation. If they were, the military invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that followed the initial 2014 aggression would never have happened. However, the little green men could be enough to sow division. They could carry out Putin's military operations without being confirmed as Russian soldiers, all while organizing separatists in the regions he targets. That brings us right back to Karl's comments. Karl believes that these same little green men will be heading into the Baltic states very soon. When and specifically where aren't specified. Karl wouldn't even tell us which officials in Russia he believes are thinking along these lines, and certainly wouldn't confirm if Putin had a defined plan in place. However, the German intelligence head says that the threat is real, and that even the US believes that Russia's covert soldiers could be heading into a NATO nation soon. They take it as seriously as us, thank God, is all that Karl said when pressed on the matter. So if Germany's intelligence is to be believed, Russia will be sending little green men into the Baltics soon. Here's why. Russia believes that NATO is in such a weakened state that the time is right for it to test the true limits of Article 5. Under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, any NATO member that is the victim of an armed attack can call upon the full force of NATO's other members to fend off that attack. Article 5 is the essence of the collective defense power of NATO. It's an all-for-one and one-for-all approach that tells any enemy that an attack on a single NATO nation incurs the wrath of all of NATO's 32 members. Only one nation has invoked Article 5 during NATO's nearly 80-year existence. In the wake of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the United States invoked Article 5. Ironically, it now seems that the only nation to have ever used Article 5 is also the country that is making Putin feel so confident that now is the time to test NATO's boundaries. Putin may believe that the US won't come running if he attacks a small European nation, and that belief may be well-founded. Current US President Donald Trump is a well-known NATO skeptic and has often derided the alliance for relying too heavily on the United States for protection. Way back in May 2017, Trump stood before America's NATO allies in Brussels to claim that massive amounts of money were owed to the US. Trump's issue at the time was that far too few of NATO's members were meeting the organization's suggested target of spending 2% of their gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense. Fast forward to 2025 and Trump's second presidential term, and the NATO skepticism still appears to be in full force. On February 11th, The Guardian reported on comments Trump made that suggested he would encourage Russia to attack any NATO member that wasn't paying its way. And in March, Trump seemed to suggest that the US wouldn't come to the aid of a NATO ally under Russian attack. "Do you think they're going to come and protect us?" Trump asked while taking questions at the Oval Office, says ABC News. "They're supposed to, I'm not so sure." Trump was pushed further by reporters, with one asking if he would make it official US policy to not protect a NATO nation that wasn't paying its way. "Well, I think it's common sense, right?" said Trump. "If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them." Putin has been paying attention to all of this. Earlier, we mentioned that his 2014 war against Ukraine was designed to create division between Europe and the United States. It hasn't happened quite how Putin intended. His initial plan was to force the rest of Europe into becoming so reliant on Russia's energy resources that Putin would always have a prominent seat at the geopolitical table of the continent. That seat would allow him to pull European nations away from America's sphere of influence, weakening NATO in the process. Instead, it's the US that seems to be pulling away from Europe, at least under Trump's stewardship. Putin won't care. He's likely rubbing his hands in glee at the division he sees today. And there's a good reason why. Without the US, NATO is severely weakened. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said as much when speaking to Politico in May. He claimed that Trump has played his cards very badly, while suggesting that Trump has significantly weakened NATO with the comments he made throughout 2025. Even if Trump isn't serious about pulling US support, the fact that he's implying he might is enough to convince Putin that now is the time to test NATO's resolve. If Trump does follow through, it's even worse news for NATO's other members. Losing the US means losing NATO's primary military threat. As Global Firepower points out, NATO would lose access to a US military that has 1.328 million active personnel and almost 800,000 reserves. The 13,043 aircraft the US has in its stockpiles would be inaccessible, as would its 440-vessel navy that's capable of shifting over 4.1 million tons of water collectively. Of course, the worst loss would be the nuclear umbrella the US would take away if it leaves NATO. Right now, Russia has 5,580 nukes, says the Arms Control Association. The US is the only nation that achieves anything like parity with those numbers, boasting 5,225 nukes of its own. With the US gone, NATO would only have access to France's 290 nuclear weapons and the UK's 225 warheads. Putin is already preparing for a direct war with NATO. On June 9th, The Guardian reported that the organization's current Secretary General, Mark Rutte, believes that NATO needs a quantum leap in our collective defense that must include thousands more tanks, millions of artillery shells, and a 5-fold boost to air defense. The Guardian also claims that Rutte believes Russia might be ready to attack NATO in 5 years, making 2030 the deadline for the quantum leap in defense. That brings us back to Putin's little green men. The full-blown invasion of a NATO member may not be coming for another 5 years, but Karl is implying that Putin may feel ready to lay some groundwork. What better way than to follow the same path he took in Ukraine? Little green men heading into the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia could stir up discontent and allow Putin to weaken all three in preparation for a full invasion. We saw it in Ukraine. In 2014, the little green men allowed Putin to wage a somewhat hidden war before 2022 brought in the full might of the Russian military. Perhaps 2025 will see those same little green men operating in the Baltics, ready for Putin to unleash his full forces in 2030. Karl certainly seems to think it's a possibility. Rutte is saying that NATO needs to get ready. The question now is simple. What is NATO doing to show Putin that his little green men approach isn't going to work? NATO knows that Russia has designs on the Baltic states, and it's already stepping up its efforts to protect them. That's according to Militani, which in its June 10th report on Karl's comments noted that Germany has launched the 45th Armored Brigade to show that it, along with NATO, is taking the threat Putin's little green men pose very seriously. That brigade will be stationed in Lithuania, with its main goal being to reinforce NATO's collective defense across its eastern flank, says Militani. The Jamestown Foundation provides more details, reporting on June 5th that the brigade was officially inaugurated on May 22nd and will eventually see Germany amass 5,000 of its soldiers inside Lithuania by 2027. That would be a permanent deployment, adding 1,800 troops to the 3,200 NATO soldiers who are currently deployed to the Baltic state. The new 45th Armored Brigade is supposed to send a message to Putin. NATO knows what he's trying to pull, and it's going to defend the nations he intends to target with his little green men. The same message is being sent by the multinational Corps Northeast. Militani calls this a key element of the alliance's structure, noting that it exists to provide more safety and security in the Baltic area. The German Bundeswehr says that Germany, along with Poland and Denmark, operates this multinational corps, which currently involves 5 divisions and around 20 support units. Both of these NATO initiatives are bad news for Putin. His little green men were so effective back in 2014 because they were deployed in areas where strong pro-Russian sentiment existed. Putin took advantage of pre-existing divisions to create new ones. Both inside Ukraine and between Europe and the United States, unity is the enemy of his little green men strategy. And that is unity that Germany and its NATO allies are trying to create with these 2 initiatives. The more the Baltic states see that its fellow NATO members are trying to defend them, the less likely it is that enough anti-Western sentiment will grow inside them for Putin's little green men to take advantage of. That might not stop Putin from deploying his hidden soldiers, but it could mean that those soldiers have to take a more direct role in this hybrid war, potentially exposing themselves and Putin in the process. All of this leads us to another question. What happens next? Right now, we don't know when the little green men will arrive in a NATO state, or if they'll arrive at all. Karl seems confident that this is the approach Putin will take, but he hasn't named his sources and won't provide any concrete details. That's to be expected. You don't become the head of a country's military intelligence division by being quick to divulge secrets. Still, it leaves us only being able to speculate on what Russia might do now that the little green men plan has been suggested as possible. We know for sure that many within NATO believe that some form of attack is coming. On June 5th, Russia Matters published a study that looked at how many times various prominent officials have claimed Putin will set his sights on a NATO nation. The year 2028 was implied or mentioned as a potential invasion year 10 times, it says. 2029 was mentioned 12 times, with 2030 being mentioned 13 times. All of which showcases that Russia looking beyond Ukraine is a hot-button issue for which NATO needs to be ready. Germany has also confirmed that it's going to be doing more to support Ukraine in its war with Russia. On May 28th, Politico reported that Germany had agreed on a new $5.7 billion aid package to Ukraine, which builds on the $19.17 billion it has already sent. That aid announcement was accompanied by another in which Germany said it was going to help Ukraine procure new long-range weapons systems it could use to strike deep into the heart of Russia. Perhaps that's the strategy Germany will take to counter Putin's little green men. By further supporting Ukraine, Germany makes Putin's most immediate enemy even stronger. A more powerful Ukraine forces Russia to dedicate more of its soldiers to dealing with Putin's supposed special military operation, leaving Russia with fewer of them to spare to send into the Baltics as little green men. Bear in mind that Russia wasn't engaged in an active war with anybody when it first used the little green men strategy in 2014. That meant Putin could choose his country's best and brightest to take part in his subterfuge. And even then, Putin himself admitted his soldiers were in Ukraine only a couple of months after the little green men were spotted. If he tries the same trick now, he's pulling from an already depleted Russian military that Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says has lost 999,200 people to death, injury, or capture as of June 11th. Many of Russia's best, likely including veterans of the first Little Green Men campaign, are gone. Germany may be thinking that strengthening Ukraine means even more Russian soldiers die, leaving Putin with a smaller pool from which to select when trying to run back the Little Green Men blueprint he created in 2014. Combine that aid with NATO's expanding presence in the Baltics and you get plenty of barriers standing in the way of the Little Green Men plan. That doesn't mean Putin won't try it, even if those covert soldiers don't help him grab territory as they did in Crimea back in 2014. The chaos they could sow would still play in his favor. The difference now is that NATO is watching and waiting. It knows what Putin is likely to pull, and it may have better ways to counter the Little Green Men than Ukraine had in 2014. But maybe Putin has bigger problems to worry about at home that could also stop the Little Green Men strategy in its tracks. China is proving to be as much of a problem for Russia as NATO ever was. In fact, you won't believe what China is doing to Russia right now, so check out our video to discover how Russia is far from the only nation with a covert plan of attack. And if you like this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest in Russia's plans to confront NATO. And thank you, as always, for watching.